I'm sitting in a meeting where every word could be used against me, and it suddenly becomes clear. The silence that protected me for years now only proves how disposable I am. The system doesn't raise its voice. It quietly rewrites my role, turning me into a variable that can be erased without consequence. Then the message arrives. Your responsibilities have been automatically reassigned. Thank you for your contribution. Before we continue and find out how it all began, please subscribe and leave a like. We'd truly love to read your comments below. The first notice arrived without warning and without a human name attached to it. Just a reference number and a deadline, printed in a font designed to look neutral and reasonable. I read it standing in a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled air, the kind of place meant to keep people moving, not thinking. The words themselves were calm, almost polite, but the implication was clear enough that my hands went cold. A process had begun and I had been entered into it without consent. I had learned long ago. When systems speak softly, they mean to be obeyed quickly. I folded the paper, placed it into my pocket, and kept walking, aware that stopping would make me visible in the wrong way. On the surface, nothing had changed. My role was there. My routine remained. The small permissions I relied on were still intact. But something essential had shifted. I could feel it in the way my name no longer appeared in full, reduced instead to an identifier that could be rearranged or erased without friction. I told myself not to overreact. The system thrived on panic, on people rushing to defend themselves before understanding the shape of the threat. I had survived by staying within the lines for years, learning which rules were rigid and which could bend if approached carefully. My value had never been loudly acknowledged, but it had been tolerated, and tolerance had felt close enough to safety. That illusion held me together as I returned to my desk and resumed the motions expected of me. The clock seemed to tick louder than usual. By the end of the day, subtle changes accumulated. Suddenly, a form I needed was restricted. A routine request was deferred without explanation. No one confronted me directly, yet the distance around me grew. An invisible boundary had been drawn, and others sensed it instinctively. The system did not accuse or threaten. It simply adjusted, and in doing so reminded me how little control I truly had. That night I replayed the notice in my mind, searching for leverage in its phrasing. There was none. It cited compliance, alignment, efficiency, words that sounded clean while carrying the weight of finality. The deadline loomed, not as a dramatic countdown, but as a quiet certainty. I understood then that waiting would not make this go away. Ignoring it would only confirm the system's assumption that I would comply without resistance. Still, resistance did not come naturally to me. I had built my survival on restraint, on choosing silence over confrontation, patience over exposure. The idea of pushing back felt reckless, almost immoral, as if asserting myself would somehow justify whatever outcome followed. I slept poorly. I was caught between two forces, the urge to disappear further into the structure and the awareness that disappearance was precisely what the process was designed to achieve. The following days reinforced that realization. Each interaction became slightly more procedural, stripped of context or explanation. Questions were answered with references to policy. Requests were met with acknowledgments rather than responses. I was no longer being engaged as a person, but managed as a variable. The pressure was not aggressive. It was relentless, a steady narrowing of options that made every choice feel like a mistake. I began to notice how others adapted. Some leaned into the change, distancing themselves preemptively. Others watched with a cautious sympathy they never voiced. No one intervened, and I did not expect them to. The system did not require collaborators. It only required compliance, and silence served just as well. That realization isolated me more effectively than any overt punishment could have. By the time the second notice arrived, I understood that this was not an error to be corrected, but a test of endurance. The language was firmer now, still courteous but less forgiving. I felt a tightening in my chest as I read it, not fear exactly, but the weight of being measured against criteria I had never agreed to. I could comply, step neatly into the reduced space being prepared for me, or I could resist and risk losing everything that still tethered me to stability. I chose neither, at least not yet. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I stayed still and paid attention. I documented every change, every restriction, every moment where the system revealed its priorities through omission rather than action. I did not know what I would do with that awareness, only that surrendering it would mean accepting the version of myself the system was constructing in my absence. As the deadline drew closer, the tension settled into my body, a constant hum beneath my thoughts. I realized then that the conflict was no longer about a single notice or decision. It was about whether I would allow my identity to be rewritten by a process that did not need my participation to proceed. The system had made its move quietly and efficiently. Now it was my turn to decide whether remaining intact was worth the cost that was clearly coming. The pressure did not escalate all at once. It refined itself. Where there had once been vague friction, there was now a precise sequence of limitations, each one small enough to justify, together forming a cage that only became visible once it was nearly closed. I noticed it first in the way time was handled around me. Deadlines shortened, response windows narrowed. Tasks that once allowed judgment were reduced to checkboxes that assumed obedience as the default state. I tried to regain footing by doing everything exactly right. I followed procedures with obsessive care. I documented each step and anticipated objections before they surfaced. For a brief moment, that effort seemed to work. Messages came back faster. Access was partially restored. The system appeared to reward compliance, and the temptation to believe I could negotiate my way back into safety was strong. It felt like standing on thin ice that stopped cracking the moment I froze in place. That illusion did not last. The next adjustment came without explanation. A responsibility I had carried for years was reassigned through an automated update, no discussion required. I was informed after the fact, thanked for my past contributions, and reminded to focus on my revised scope. The language was neutral, almost kind, but the effect was unmistakable. Something that had anchored my relevance was gone, and I had not been given the chance to argue for it. I began to understand that precision was being used against me. The system did not need me to fail. It needed me to fit. Each corrective action nudged me toward a version of myself that was easier to categorize and easier to replace. When I asked questions, I received links. When I requested clarification, I was told the process was still ongoing. The ongoing nature of it was the point. As long as nothing was final, nothing could be challenged. The cost of maintaining composure grew heavier. I stopped speaking in meetings unless directly addressed, not out of fear but calculation. Every word felt like potential evidence, something that could be extracted and interpreted without context. Silence, once a strategy of survival, became another form of compliance, and I could feel the contradiction tightening inside me. Staying quiet protected me from immediate consequences, yet confirmed the system's assumption that I had nothing essential to contribute. Outside the formal channels, reactions shifted. Some people avoided eye contact. Others became overly careful, their voices flattening as if emotion itself were a liability. No one acknowledged what was happening directly, but everyone seemed to sense the change in status. I had crossed an invisible threshold, moving from participant to subject, and the difference altered every interaction. The most unsettling part was how reasonable it all appeared. There was no villain to confront, no decision-maker to persuade. The pressure came from alignment metrics, compliance frameworks, future planning models. When I tried to imagine appealing the situation, I could not find a clear entry point. Everything was distributed, justified by efficiency, protected by abstraction. Fighting it directly would mean fighting air. As the days passed, the system's patience became more obvious than its hostility. It did not rush me. It waited, confident that exhaustion would do the work it did not have to. I felt that exhaustion creeping in, not as panic, but as doubt. Doubt about whether my resistance, quiet as it was, mattered at all. Doubt about whether preserving my sense of self was worth the instability that now followed me everywhere. The moment of false hope arrived quietly. A message appeared suggesting a review, an opportunity to clarify my position. The wording implied fairness, even openness. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that reason might still apply, that the system could be reminded of the human variable it was compressing. I prepared carefully, aligning my language with its values, framing my concerns in terms it respected. The response came quickly and settled the matter without drama. The review acknowledged my input, thanked me for my cooperation, and reiterated the necessity of the current direction. Nothing changed. The door I thought had opened had never existed. The system had not invited dialogue. It had measured my willingness to adapt. That realization marked a shift inside me. The problem was no longer how to comply without disappearing, but whether disappearance was already the intended outcome. The pressure intensified not through new restrictions, but through the cumulative weight of inevitability. I understood then that every careful choice I had made was being absorbed, neutralized, and used to reinforce the same conclusion. By the end of that week, I stopped asking how to fix the situation. The question no longer made sense. The system was functioning exactly as designed. What I needed to decide was whether I would continue shaping myself to fit its narrowing definition, or whether I would accept the cost of stepping outside it, knowing there would be no gentle path back. The break did not come as an attack. It came as clarity. Sharp and unwelcome, it cut through the last layer of rationalization I had been using to stay upright. I realized it one morning while reviewing another revision of my responsibilities, a document so streamlined it barely resembled the work I was still expected to perform. The system was not correcting my position. It was preparing for my absence, mapping continuity without me while keeping me functional just long enough to avoid disruption. That understanding rewired the pressure entirely. Fear gave way to something colder. I stopped interpreting signals as negotiations or warnings and began seeing them as confirmations. Each delay, each deflection, each polite acknowledgement was evidence that the outcome had already been modeled and approved somewhere far beyond my reach. I was not being evaluated anymore. I was being phased out. The lowest point was not marked by a single loss, but by the collapse of a belief I had relied on for years. That restraint could protect dignity. I had assumed that if I stayed measured, if I avoided emotional missteps, the system would eventually recognize my consistency as value. Instead, restraint had made me invisible in the most literal sense. There was nothing left to argue against because my presence itself had become optional. I tested the edges one last time, not by rebelling but by withdrawing effort that went beyond formal obligation. The result was immediate and telling. Nothing broke, nothing slowed. The system compensated effortlessly, redistributing load with mechanical indifference. The absence I feared creating had already been accounted for. That was the moment the illusion of indispensability finally died. What replaced it was not despair, but a grim kind of freedom. If my contribution could be erased without consequence, then preserving it at any cost no longer made sense. I began to see how much energy I had spent maintaining an image of compatibility, smoothing friction that was never meant to resolve. The system did not want my full self. It wanted my compliance, and only until that compliance could be automated or absorbed elsewhere. The last internal barrier fell when I recognized my own complicity. By staying silent, by adapting endlessly, I had helped validate the process that was now consuming me. That recognition was painful, but it stripped away the remaining hesitation. This was no longer about fairness or recognition. It was about whether I would continue participating in my own reduction. I stopped waiting for permission. Not to act decisively yet, but to think differently. I allowed myself to consider outcomes I had previously dismissed as unacceptable. Instability, uncertainty, loss of status. They no longer felt like threats. They felt like prices, and prices can be weighed. The fear that had kept me compliant lost its leverage once I named it clearly. By then, the system's signals grew colder. Communication narrowed to essentials. Timelines solidified. There was no urgency, no hostility, just forward motion. I stood at the edge of that motion, no longer pretending I could redirect it from within. The realization was complete and irreversible. Whatever choice I made next would not restore what had been taken, but it would determine whether I remained intact or allowed myself to be fully rewritten. That was the moment I reached my lowest point, not because everything was lost, but because I could finally see how little of it had ever been mine to begin with. I did not announce the choice when it finally came. There was no confrontation, no declaration meant to be heard or remembered. I made it quietly, the way I had learned to do everything important, by removing myself from the assumptions that no longer served me. The system expected either compliance or resistance, something legible within its models. What it did not account for was refusal without spectacle. I stopped performing alignment. I met requirements precisely and nothing more, not as protest, but as boundary. Where I once anticipated needs, I now waited for instruction. Where I once smoothed transitions, I allowed friction to exist. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible day to day, yet it altered the dynamic in ways I could feel immediately. The system responded with increased formality, tightening language, reducing ambiguity. It wanted me predictable again. The final step was not a dramatic exit, but a redefinition of risk. I accepted that stability as I had known it was already gone, preserved only as a temporary courtesy. Once that was clear, the remaining leverage dissolved. I redirected my attention to what remained within my control. My time, my attention, my willingness to internalize narratives that did not belong to me. I prepared for the consequences without trying to manage them. When the formal conclusion arrived, it did so exactly as expected. Polite, efficient, framed as an outcome rather than a decision. I read it once, then again, noticing how little emotion it provoked. There was relief in that absence. The system had completed its process, and I was no longer required to participate in it. The loss was real, but it was finite. What remained was undefined and therefore open. In the days that followed, I felt the weight of uncertainty settle in. It did not lift quickly, and it did not resolve into optimism. There were moments of doubt, flashes of instinctive regret, the old reflex to wonder whether a different kind of compliance might have produced a softer landing. Those thoughts passed when I remembered how narrow that landing had already become. I did not emerge victorious. There was no reversal, no acknowledgement of harm, no restoration of what had been reduced. What I gained was colder and less visible. The knowledge that my identity no longer required validation from a structure that could not recognize it without reshaping it first. The system continued unchanged and indifferent. I continued too, altered but intact. The story does not end with resolution. It ends with direction. I move forward carrying the awareness of what it costs to remain oneself inside systems designed to optimize away complexity. The pressure is gone, replaced by responsibility, and that responsibility is heavier than compliance ever was. But it is mine, and that makes all the difference I am willing to claim.